Welcome to Guide to IELTS. The Writing Task 1 questions of IELTS Academic can be divided into three broad categories based on how we need to tackle the questions and the kind of vocabulary we need. The first category includes tables and graphs, that is bar graph, line graph, pie chart, and tables, or a combination of any of these. The second is maps, and the third, the one that we'll be discussing in this video, is a process. It is usually assumed that writing a report about a process is easier because there is no data to interpret. You just need to describe the different steps of the given process. However, you do need to work on the vocabulary because just using then and after that repeatedly to describe the steps is not acceptable. Also, you may get a process that you're not familiar with, so do practice a few of these. You can get a natural process or a man-made process. Examples of a natural process are the life cycle of an organism and the water cycle. As for examples of man-made processes, there's production of silk cloth, electric power plants, and cement and concrete production. You could get two processes which are interconnected. For example, the life cycle of silkworm plus the production of silk cloth, or cement production and concrete production. Or you could just get one process, in which case it is sometimes difficult to write 150 words. Now we'll talk about the steps that you need to follow when you get a process question in Writing Task 1 of IELTS Academic. First, look at each step, figure it out, understand it. Second, identify what the first step is. The steps are usually numbered, so you know where to start. If they are not numbered, it is usually very obvious where you need to start from. For example, in this process of hydroelectric power station, you'd obviously start from the top, that is the river. In any case, identify where you're going to start from. Third, notice any additional information given because you need to incorporate it in your writing. In this process of concrete production, the meaning of gravel is elaborated at the bottom. You need to include this in your writing when you're writing about the part where there's gravel. Similarly, in this life cycle of salmon, the information at the bottom is not a separate process but contains the names and sizes of the fish at different stages of its life. Next, we'll talk about some challenges that you need to be on a lookout for when writing a report to describe a process. If it is a single process, there's a possibility that you may struggle with reaching the required 150 word count. An example of this is this process of geothermal power plant. If you have a process which looks like a short process, as you're writing, make sure you write longer phrases when you move from one step to the other. So instead of saying firstly this happens and secondly this happens, I'd rather write in the first step we have cold water in a rectangular reservoir which is pumped down to a depth of 4.5 kilometers. So instead of just saying in the next step or next this happens, I would say after the water has been pumped down or after pumping down of the water. So I'm consciously writing longer phrases when I move from one step to the other to make sure that low word count should not be a problem. Next, before you start writing, observe if the arrows are moving in only one direction. If it is only one direction, there are no issues. You can just write about one step after the other. However, if certain steps have arrows in both directions or there is more than one arrow leading to a step, you need to plan how to write it beforehand. For example, in this hydroelectric power station, some steps have arrows in both directions, different for day and night. Another example is this silk cloth production process, in which either the cloth or the thread can be dyed. So just because you get a process in your test doesn't mean you don't need to plan at all before you start writing. Let's now talk about the format to follow when writing on a process. Paragraph 1 is introduction, paraphrasing of the question, just as we do in any other report. Paragraphs 2 and 3 will have the overall statement followed by a description of the process. What can we include in the overall statement? Well, if the number of steps is mentioned, you write that there are these many steps in this process, or this process consists of these many steps. If the number of steps is not mentioned, write the number if it is very clear. In the overall statement, you could also mention the duration of the life cycle. For example, in this life cycle of silkworm, I can write that it takes approximately 10 weeks. You could also mention any other striking details that you see. For example, in this one, I'd mention that some steps of the process work differently during day and night. If there are two processes, we'd write about the first process in paragraph 2 and about the second process in paragraph 3. However, if you're writing on only one process, it is advised that you still make two separate paragraphs. This is because one small introductory paragraph followed by a huge body paragraph is not recommended. So, if there are 5 steps, you could have 2 steps in one paragraph and 3 steps in the other. Next, let's talk about which tense we need to use when we are writing about a process. We need to write the process in present tense. However, there's a difference in how you write about a natural process versus a man-made process. A natural process usually needs to be written in active voice or present indefinite tense, whereas a man-made process is usually written in passive voice or present indefinite tense. So in this life cycle, I would use the active voice. The moth lays eggs on a mulberry leaf. Next, the eggs hatch and larva emerges from it. In contrast, when I'm writing about the production of silk cloth, I'd use passive voice. A cocoon is selected, which is then boiled in water. I could also write in active voice, we select a cocoon and then we boil it in water, but it is better to write in passive voice. In our upcoming videos, we'll talk about the vocabulary that we need when writing about a process, followed by a few sample process writings. Bye for now from Guide to IELTS.